Inside a televised Senate hearing on border security, Jasmine Crockett confronts Chuck Schumer, exposing his doublespeak on immigration policy. He tries to dismiss her with polished rhetoric, but just minutes later, she reveals irrefutable evidence from his past that turns his argument to dust. The chamber erupts, Schumer freezes, and within hours, his decades-long credibility begins to collapse. The fallout is instant. Headlines explode, alliances fracture, and trust in leadership is shaken. So now the question is, when the truth is this undeniable, why was it hidden for so long? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing wasn't planned. It was launched like a political ambush. Within 48 hours of announcement, Capitol Hill was buzzing over a special session led by Chuck Schumer, titled The Human and Security Crisis at the Southern Border. But behind the humanitarian packaging was a clear objective: retake the immigration narrative and crush dissent within the ranks. The guest list confirmed it: federal security officials, policy experts, and one unexpected outlier: Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. A progressive firebrand from Texas, she had fiercely criticized how both parties use the border as a political football. Her inclusion wasn't about balance, it was bait, a trap with microphones. By dawn, the chamber felt like a set stage. Lights were hotter than usual, cameras closer, and Crockett's seat, isolated, distant from the others, made the setup obvious. She wasn't there to participate, she was there to be framed. Schumer entered, flanked by aides, basking in the quiet reverence of the room. No acknowledgement, no handshake, just a cold smirk as he passed her row. He knew the script: an old man playing wise statesman, setting up a younger opponent to stumble live on air. But Jasmine had seen enough of these power games to know the pattern, and she hadn't come to play along. The gavel dropped. Schumer began with poetic restraint. We're not here to assign blame, but to seek truth in policy. A line meant to disarm, but his glance toward Jasmine lingered, a subtle cue that she was the problem to be neutralized. Around her, journalists shifted, waiting to capture a fumble. Staffers whispered, some already drafting headlines before the first testimony. Crockett sat still, calm on the surface. But inside, something was coiling. What Schumer didn't know was that while he planned a press moment, she'd prepared a reckoning. But as the room leaned forward, expecting another carefully staged hearing, Jasmine Crockett already recognized the pattern. Not a dialogue, but a monologue dressed in virtue, built to shield power behind poetry. Chuck Schumer rose slowly, deliberately, the weight of decades in politics draped across his shoulders like a well-fitted cloak. He adjusted the microphone with care, the kind of precision that came not from nerves, but from routine. The room stilled, journalists frozen mid-keystroke, cameras fixed, staffers with pens half lifted, as if awaiting a sermon. We are here today, Schumer began, voice low, solemn, controlled, because this country must decide what kind of people we are. He paused, a rhetorical beat. We cannot, and we must not, tolerate walls, cruelty, or division wrapped in the false promise of safety. We are better than that. On the surface, it sounded noble. Underneath, it was a calculated strike. Then came the pivot. He looked toward the left side of the chamber, not directly at Jasmine, but near enough to land like a guided missile. Too often, passion replaces perspective. And unfortunately, some of our younger colleagues in Congress have yet to understand the nuance, the sheer complexity of the border we are trying to secure. There was no need to say her name. The implication was surgical. Jasmine sat alone at the far end of the witness table, her presence already marked, not by introduction, but by insinuation. Around her, camera shutters clicked with renewed interest, panning toward her with the unspoken question: is she the one he means? Inside the gallery, aides exchanged knowing glances. Across the web, progressive media outlets clipped the quote, dressed it with golden lighting, and hailed it as statesmanship at its finest. Schumer defends American values in emotional border speech. Cable news Chiron writers move faster than the gavel. Pundits tweeted praise before the next sentence was even spoken. But for Jasmine, the applause sounded hollow. Not because she had been attacked, But because she had been flattened, condensed into a straw figure, the young radical who didn't understand how things worked, it wasn't just dismissive, it was deliberate. Schumer had used the full weight of his institutional credibility to box her in before she had even opened her mouth. That was the true cruelty, not in what was said, but in what was implied. That her presence was noise to be filtered, not a voice to be heard. That she was passionate but not prepared. That she belonged to a generation loud enough to protest, but not mature enough to legislate. It was a tactic as old as politics itself. Dress condescension in the language of unity, and the public will clap for your composure. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't reach for her notes or glance at an aide. Instead, she sat taller. Because while Schumer was performing for the cameras, Jasmine had come prepared for something else entirely. She hadn't brought applause. She brought facts. She didn't need to look dignified. She needed to be undeniable. And in just a few minutes, the man who opened with morality would be buried under his own record. So when the microphone turned to Jasmine Crockett, the room leaned in, not out of respect, but expectation. They thought they knew what was coming, a fiery rebuttal, maybe an emotional defense. But Jasmine didn't come to react. She came to reveal. She began without ceremony. No raised voice, no dramatic pause, just calm, deliberate motion as she slid a white folder across the table, opened it with steady hands, and lifted the first document. "Before we discuss what's humane," she said clearly, "let's recall what's on record." Her voice cut through the chamber, not loud but unmistakably firm. This is a transcript from a 2006 press conference in New York City. Senator Schumer stated, and I quote, "We need more physical barriers. We need increased ICE enforcement, and we need expedited deportation procedures to protect American labor from illegal competition." She held the page in the air so the cameras could capture the letterhead. The words weren't paraphrased. They were direct, dated, and signed. And in that moment, every narrative Schumer had constructed about morality and compassion began to splinter. The silence that followed wasn't respectful. It was unsettled. Jasmine knew the room wasn't used to contradictions spoken so plainly, but she didn't wait for approval. She turned the page and continued. In 2013, Senator Schumer joined the Gang of Eight, a bipartisan team pushing for immigration reform. Here, she said, pulling out a second document, is a draft memorandum bearing his signature. The title reads, "Tactical Barrier Zones, Legislative Language Draft." She placed it on the table, letting the words face outward like evidence in a trial. This document outlines specific support for physical fencing in high-risk sectors of the border. It details funding, strategies, enforcement zones, and projected manpower increases. Her tone never wavered. She wasn't there to accuse. She was there to remind. The same measures now dismissed as xenophobic and extremist were once introduced by this chamber's most senior Democrat. Cameras clicked. Reporters stopped whispering. And Schumer, still seated just feet away, stared straight ahead, blinking slowly as if trying to process what had just been unwrapped in front of him. Jasmine didn't glance his way. Her focus was the record, the truth, the glaring disconnect between public condemnation and private authorship. "This isn't about changing minds," she said finally. "It's about admitting facts. The same policies being vilified today are the ones many of you once called necessary, strategic, even humane." Her voice stayed even, but the message was seismic. She hadn't come to defend herself. She had come to make memory unavoidable. And in doing so, she cracked the first fault line in a structure built on selective truth. As the final document landed with a quiet, definitive thud on the witness table, Jasmine Crockett looked up, not to the press, not to the audience, but to the man seated across from her, cloaked in seniority and silence. The room had been handed the truth. Now it was time for the question that truth demanded. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words carried the weight of something far heavier than anger. Clarity. "Senator Schumer," she began, her tone calm but unflinching, "at what point did a border fence become a symbol of cruelty?" The silence that followed was different now. Not the theatrical pause of politics, but the raw stillness that comes when a truth can't be dodged. She let the question breathe, eyes fixed on him, not blinking, not retreating. Was it cruel in 2006 when you said we needed more barriers and faster deportations to protect American labor? Was it cruel in 2013 when you signed off on strategic fencing in high-traffic sectors? She paused, but not to give him space, to tighten it. Or did it only become cruel when it was no longer politically useful to you? The words hit harder because they weren't accusatory. They were undeniable. Crockett didn't speak with venom. She spoke like a surgeon cutting around rot, exposing a contradiction too large to hide. Because from where I sit, Senator, she continued, voice steady, each word deliberate, you're not condemning policy. You're condemning whoever happens to be proposing it now. The fence didn't change. The danger didn't change. What changed was who you thought it was safer to stand next to in front of a camera. Her tone didn't rise, but the impact did. Journalists who had come to write her off were now scribbling faster than they could think. Some simply watched, stunned. She folded her hands calmly on the table. If the barrier is evil today, she said, it was evil when your office funded it. And if it was reasonable then, it deserves an honest debate now, not moral outrage crafted for a headline. Her gaze stayed on him, not hostile, but unwavering, like someone waiting for an adult to own his own reflection. Chuck Schumer didn't answer. His face tightened, but no words came. In that moment, surrounded by advisors, cameras, and his own party's approval ratings, he looked not like a leader under attack, but like a man cornered by his own past. And Jasmine? She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply waited, because the silence said everything she didn't have to. The room was already rattled, but Jasmine Crockett wasn't about to let it settle. Because in Washington, silence is where spin survives. And she wasn't there to let anything survive that wasn't the truth. She leaned forward, her voice quieter now. Not because it had lost strength, but because the power of what she held next didn't need volume. I'd like to enter into the record a transcript from a private meeting held on March 9, 2021, she said, lifting a marked folder and unfolding a document whose contents had, until now, never seen daylight. Present were Senator Schumer and 3 governors from border states, 2 Democrats, 1 independent. The topic? Border stabilization and federal strategy. She paused, letting the shift in the room settle like dust before an earthquake. In this meeting, Senator Schumer acknowledged, in plain language, that the Remain in Mexico policy was, quote, difficult but necessary to manage flow and prevent resource collapse. A few reporters blinked. Some gasped. Aides looked up from their phones, frozen. Jasmine didn't look at them. She looked at him. But more than that, he gave an instruction, word for word. We can't message this. It'll cause internal fractures in the party. Keep it off the table until post-midterms. She placed the document down with reverence, like it was evidence at a trial, which in many ways it was. Senator, she said, tone still even, but unmistakably sharper now, you didn't just support a policy you now call inhumane. You protected it in private. You asked others to stay silent about it. You didn't fight it, you buried it. And not because it was wrong, but because admitting the truth was inconvenient. She looked around the chamber, scanning the faces of colleagues and journalists who had spent months repeating a narrative now bleeding at its seams. Let's be clear, this isn't about whether Remain in Mexico is a good policy or not. Reasonable people can debate that. This is about whether those who govern are telling the truth when they stand at this table. She let that land, then finished softly but without apology. This is not a disagreement over vision. This is a breach of trust, and that should terrify every voter in this country far more than a fence ever could. For a few long seconds, the chamber was still, suspended between revelation and response, until the man at the center of it all finally broke the silence, reaching not for truth, but for distance. Chuck Schumer adjusted his glasses, the same way he always did before pivoting, and leaned into the mic with a voice laced in forced composure. That was a different time, he said, each word landing heavier than he intended. The country has changed. The border has changed. What was strategic then would be unacceptable now. His tone was firm, but his delivery was rushed, as if outrunning the weight of his own past. It's not hypocrisy, he added, glancing sideways toward Jasmine without naming her. It's adaptation. Leaders evolve with the moment. He tried to sound measured, but the tremor at the edge of his words betrayed him. He wasn't explaining. He was scrambling, and everyone in the room could feel it. The subtle shift from confident control to exposed retreat. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. The damage was already folding in on itself. Schumer's defense, that time had changed, and so had he, only widened the very gap she had just finished exposing. Because what he called evolution, she had already shown to be concealment. What he claimed was adaptation, she had proved was manipulation. And now, in front of a national audience, his only answer to pages of signed memos, transcripts, and private directives was a shrug dressed in moral language. The contrast was blinding. She had brought receipts. He had brought a vague appeal to shifting times. And in politics, there is no greater sign of retreat than a man forced to explain what he once denied he ever did. Schumer's words sat in the air like fog. Vague, deflective, meant to buy time rather than offer truth. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't there for vague. She was there for clarity, and now she delivered it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every syllable was sharp, and every pause deliberate. "Yes, Senator," she said quietly, leaning forward just enough to close the distance between them. "The country has changed. No one denies that. But the people didn't change their trust in you. You changed what you told them, without ever saying you did." Her eyes locked on his, unwavering. "You didn't come to the podium and say, 'I've reconsidered.' You didn't explain. You didn't engage. You just shifted. Quietly, politically, safely." The words weren't laced with rage. They were heavier than that. They were laced with disappointment, the kind that cuts deeper than accusation. "And when the rest of us stepped up to defend policies you once helped write, you called us reckless. You called us extreme." Her voice didn't rise, but the silence around her deepened. She let the weight of that truth settle before she spoke again. "You didn't just move the goalposts, you buried them. And when someone like me tried to dig them back up, you told the press I didn't understand the game." There was no dramatics in her delivery. It was cold, clinical, and precise, like a surgeon cutting to the core. "But I understand it just fine. You don't fear that I'm wrong. You fear that I'm reminding the public of who you used to be, before the headlines, before the polling, before the strategy rooms decided what you could and couldn't say." The injustice was clear now, not just in what Schumer had done, but in the way he'd rewritten his own past and tried to shame others for refusing to forget it. Jasmine's gaze didn't soften. Her voice didn't crack. She was no longer on defense. She was holding a mirror up to power and refusing to let it look away. The chamber had already absorbed revelations about hypocrisy, silence, and moral contradiction. But Jasmine Crockett knew that to fully expose a machine like this, you didn't just follow the rhetoric, you followed the money. She slid a crisp page onto the desk before her, its header stamped with FEC filing data. Not commentary, not speculation, but hard public record. Her tone was calm, but there was weight behind every word. "Between 2015 and 2023, she said, letting her eyes sweep the room, Senator Schumer received more than $1.7 million in campaign contributions from transportation and logistics conglomerates. Companies whose profit margins depend directly on one thing: cheap, invisible labor." The room shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Schumer didn't move, but his staff did. A flicker of anxiety, glances between phones and one another. Jasmine continued, voice unwavering. "These corporations have quietly lobbied against enforcement at the border, not out of humanitarian concern, but because lax enforcement helps their bottom line. No background checks, no wage protections, no accountability." She held up the document again, rotating it slightly toward the cameras. "These are the same companies that oppose E-Verify, that fight any regulation that might expose who's really stocking their shelves and driving their trucks." Her words weren't just persuasive, they were damning. "And here's the pattern. When enforcement policies threaten their labor pool, they donate. And when the donations land, The outrage about those same policies gets louder from this podium. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every syllable landed like a gavel. That's not advocacy. That's not principle. That's transactional politics. And when working families, the same ones you claim to fight for, suffer under the weight of that system, it's not because we lack compassion, it's because we lack honesty. Jasmine turned back to Schumer, her voice steady but stripped of all pretense. You tell the American people that tougher enforcement is cruel. But what's crueler, a wall or a system that quietly exploits undocumented workers for corporate gain while pretending to be about dignity? The injustice was now fully illuminated, not just in words unsaid, but in money accepted, policies softened, and accountability deferred. And for the first time in the hearing, even the cameras seemed to hesitate, unsure whether to keep filming a debate or a reckoning. Up until now, Jasmine Crockett had laid out a trail of contradictions, shifting policies, concealed intentions, corporate influence. But the final blow wasn't theoretical, financial, or ideological. It was an unfiltered confession, one that had never been meant to see the light. She pulled out a single sheet of paper, simple, almost unimpressive in appearance. But its contents made the air in the chamber feel heavier. She held it up with steady hands and an even steadier voice. This is an internal email, she began, dated October 3rd, 2022, sent from a senior executive at Midcon Freight Logistics to a legislative liaison connected to multiple Senate offices, including, according to metadata, those of the majority leader. She didn't look for dramatic effect. She didn't need it. Her authority came from the clarity of what was on the page. The body of the message reads, "Keeping the border fluid is an economic strategy. Don't say that out loud. Focus the messaging on compassion, national values, and humanitarian concern. It polls better." She stopped. Not for effect, but because the room needed a second to absorb what had just been said. The silence wasn't respectful. It was stunned. Because in that one paragraph, the entire moral justification surrounding border policy had been exposed for what it often was: a calculated marketing script, carefully constructed to distract from the machinery behind it. Jasmine didn't flinch. This isn't spin. This is not a blog post or a tweet. This is a deliberate communication between powerful industry and policymakers. It admits, without apology, that the suffering of immigrants, the stress on our enforcement agencies, and the erosion of public trust are all just costs. Costs in service of labor exploitation and campaign donations. Her voice didn't tremble. If anything, it steadied. And while voters are told that opposing open border policies is cruel, the truth, right here, is that keeping those borders open was never about kindness. It was about profit. She laid the email down gently, like setting a final piece on a chessboard. "So when you accuse people like me of being unfeeling for wanting smart enforcement," she said, turning her gaze back to Schumer, "what you're really doing is defending the quiet parts of this system, the parts written in private, by people who will never sit at this table, who never get questioned, and who never appear in front of a camera." Her voice, now low and resolute, delivered the final line without hesitation. "You didn't just stay silent about this, Senator. You stood in front of it and called it justice." In that moment, the chamber didn't feel like a hearing room. It felt like a courtroom. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't just questioning policy. She was delivering a verdict. The room had grown unbearably still, the kind of silence that only follows the collapse of something once believed to be immovable. But silence, as Jasmine Crockett knew too well, never lasted long. Not in Washington. And the moment it cracked, it came from the press. A Politico journalist stood slowly, her voice calm but sharpened by the weight of what had just unfolded. "Senator Schumer," she said, her tone devoid of theatrics, "can you confirm whether or not you ever supported the use of physical border barriers?" The words echoed across the chamber, as stark and unflinching as the documents Jasmine had laid bare minutes earlier. The question was simple, but it carried the force of a verdict. Schumer blinked once, then again, as if buying time with gestures he could no longer afford. He leaned forward to the mic, his voice quieter now, more measured. But the controlled cadence he was known for was missing. I I don't recall signing on to anything specific, he said. There are always conversations, discussions, evolving proposals. I don't believe I personally approved any official text endorsing physical barriers. He avoided eye contact with the press, with the crowd, and most of all, with Jasmine. But avoidance wasn't protection, not here. The impact was instant, not because he raised his voice, but because he lowered the standard. It wasn't a denial, it was a retreat. A man who'd wielded words as weapons for decades now stood cornered, hoping ambiguity would save him from a truth already too visible to ignore. But the facts weren't vague. They weren't forgotten. Jasmine had shown his signature, his annotations, his name printed atop policy drafts. This wasn't about interpretation. It was about memory and his selective use of it. What made the moment so devastating wasn't just the contradiction, but the insult buried within it, that the American people would forget as easily as he claimed to, that they wouldn't connect the dots between his private support, his public condemnation, and the very real consequences of that duplicity. The room had already begun to shift, tension thickening, the press leaning forward, Schumer's answers unraveling. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't here to stir discomfort. She was here to end illusions, and she had saved the sharpest blade for last. Without a hint of ceremony, she reached down and retrieved a final sheet, a full-page scan, blown up just enough for even those in the back row to see. She held it up with quiet deliberation, the kind of confidence that comes not from outrage, but from irrefutable truth. This document, she said, voice steady and deliberate, is from a 2018 internal draft of a Senate border policy proposal. She walked toward the committee display screen where the image was already cued and enlarged. On it, the original typed language was plain, but in the margin, scrawled in firm, slanted ink, was a handwritten instruction. Jasmine's voice didn't rise, but it grew colder, clearer. It says, urgent, add language to include tactical border fencing, CS. That's your handwriting, Senator Schumer. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Chairs creaked, reporters snapped upright, some gasped without meaning to. It wasn't just the content, it was the finality. The last possible doubt erased. The note wasn't vague. It wasn't theoretical. It was direct, decisive, and signed. Schumer didn't move. His face, once composed in practiced neutrality, was now unreadable. But silence in that moment wasn't strength. It was surrender. Jasmine lowered the page slowly, placing it on the table like the final card in a hand she'd been building all morning. So I'll ask again, she said, eyes locked onto him with unblinking resolve. When exactly did tactical border fencing become inhumane? Before or after you personally demanded it be written into law? She didn't add anything further. She didn't need to. The room was already holding its breath. The document, her voice, and the question. They had done what hours of debate could not. Strip away the performance, the talking points, the choreography. What was left was a man, a signature, and a silence that echoed louder than any defense ever could. With the document still fresh on the screen and the silence in the chamber deepening into something heavier than discomfort, Jasmine Crockett stepped back to the microphone. Not to deliver another blow, but to deliver the truth that had been missing from the debate for far too long. Her voice came steady, grounded, but now laced with something more. Something that wasn't anger, wasn't even frustration. It was urgency. Border policy is not a backdrop for press conferences, she began, eyes sweeping the room, locking briefly with each camera, each face that had watched this unfold. It's not a branding exercise. It's not a rhetorical prop to win the next news cycle. It is a matter of life and death, for families caught in desperation, for agents under pressure, and for a country that is fracturing under the weight of double standards. Her words hit not like accusations, but as clarifying strikes, cutting through the fog of spin, reclaiming the conversation from those who had hijacked it for political theater. And the American people, she continued, her voice hardening now, deserve to know who's fighting for solutions and who's playing shell games with their trust. She turned, fully facing Schumer now, no longer just presenting, confronting. What we've seen today is not just policy inconsistency, it's linguistic manipulation. It's moral bait and switch. It's one story told in public and another signed in private. And for what? Political capital? Donor satisfaction? A few more glowing headlines? Her hands didn't move. She didn't raise her voice. But every word vibrated with controlled force. I am not against immigration. I am not against compassion. I am not, as some have suggested, motivated by fear or by bias or by cruelty. I am against the lie that we can keep borders open, enforcement weak, and still claim we're protecting anyone. A few heads in the gallery nodded, almost involuntarily. Her clarity was beginning to cut across affiliations. The impact was instant, not because he raised his voice, but because he lowered the standard. It wasn't a denial, it was a retreat. A man who'd wielded words as weapons for decades now stood cornered, hoping ambiguity would save him from a truth already too visible to ignore. But the facts weren't vague. They weren't forgotten. Jasmine had shown his signature, his annotations, his name printed atop policy drafts. This wasn't about interpretation. It was about memory and his selective use of it. What made the moment so devastating wasn't just the contradiction, but the insult buried within it, that the American people would forget as easily as he claimed to, that they wouldn't connect the dots between his private support, his public condemnation, and the very real consequences of that duplicity. The room had already begun to shift, tension thickening, the press leaning forward, Schumer's answers unraveling. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't here to stir discomfort. She was here to end illusions, and she had saved the sharpest blade for last. Without a hint of ceremony, she reached down and retrieved a final sheet, a full-page scan, blown up just enough for even those in the back row to see. She held it up with quiet deliberation, the kind of confidence that comes not from outrage, but from irrefutable truth. This document, she said, voice steady and deliberate, is from a 2018 internal draft of a Senate border policy proposal. She walked toward the committee display screen where the image was already cued and enlarged. On it, the original typed language was plain, but in the margin, scrawled in firm, slanted ink, was a handwritten instruction. Jasmine's voice didn't rise, but it grew colder, clearer. It says, urgent, add language to include tactical border fencing, CS. That's your handwriting, Senator Schumer. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Chairs creaked, reporters snapped upright, some gasped without meaning to. It wasn't just the content, it was the finality. The last possible doubt erased. The note wasn't vague. It wasn't theoretical. It was direct, decisive, and signed. Schumer didn't move. His face, once composed in practiced neutrality, was now unreadable. But silence in that moment wasn't strength. It was surrender. Jasmine lowered the page slowly, placing it on the table like the final card in a hand she'd been building all morning. So I'll ask again, she said, eyes locked onto him with unblinking resolve. When exactly did tactical border fencing become inhumane? Before or after you personally demanded it be written into law? She didn't add anything further. She didn't need to. The room was already holding its breath. The document, her voice, and the question. They had done what hours of debate could not. Strip away the performance, the talking points, the choreography. What was left was a man, a signature, and a silence that echoed louder than any defense ever could. With the document still fresh on the screen and the silence in the chamber deepening into something heavier than discomfort, Jasmine Crockett stepped back to the microphone. Not to deliver another blow, but to deliver the truth that had been missing from the debate for far too long. Her voice came steady, grounded, but now laced with something more. Something that wasn't anger, wasn't even frustration. It was urgency. Border policy is not a backdrop for press conferences, she began, eyes sweeping the room, locking briefly with each camera, each face that had watched this unfold. It's not a branding exercise. It's not a rhetorical prop to win the next news cycle. It is a matter of life and death, for families caught in desperation, for agents under pressure, and for a country that is fracturing under the weight of double standards. Her words hit not like accusations, but as clarifying strikes, cutting through the fog of spin, reclaiming the conversation from those who had hijacked it for political theater. And the American people, she continued, her voice hardening now, deserve to know who's fighting for solutions and who's playing shell games with their trust. She turned, fully facing Schumer now, no longer just presenting, confronting. What we've seen today is not just policy inconsistency, it's linguistic manipulation. It's moral bait and switch. It's one story told in public and another signed in private. And for what? Political capital? Donor satisfaction? A few more glowing headlines? Her hands didn't move. She didn't raise her voice. But every word vibrated with controlled force. I am not against immigration. I am not against compassion. I am not, as some have suggested, motivated by fear or by bias or by cruelty. I am against the lie that we can keep borders open, enforcement weak, and still claim we're protecting anyone. A few heads in the gallery nodded, almost involuntarily. Her clarity was beginning to cut across affiliations. Cable news couldn't ignore it. Even networks that had once relegated Jasmine to footnotes began airing segments titled, "When Truth Becomes Too Loud to Ignore," and "Border Politics Blown Wide Open." Schumer's office released a carefully worded statement late that evening, calling the hearing a complex and sometimes tense exchange of perspectives. But they didn't deny the document. They didn't address the signature. They didn't explain the contradiction, because they couldn't. And Jasmine, she didn't gloat. She didn't issue follow-ups. She simply posted the full video of her testimony with one caption: "Facts don't fear microphones." Within an hour, it hit 1 million views. The impact stretched beyond the headlines. Staffers inside the Capitol began whispering about the Crockett moment. Junior members who had once stayed silent in hearings now rehearsed bolder openings. Aides to moderate senators scrambled to review past votes and internal memos. Something had shifted, not because one hearing changed a party, but because one voice reminded everyone that records don't fade just because cameras do. And for every headline that tried to soften what happened, there were 100 voices online saying what couldn't be unsaid anymore. Jasmine Crockett had exposed the two faces of power and forced one of them into the light. As the clip stormed across social media and the echo of Jasmine's words settled into the political bloodstream, something rare and irreversible began to unfold. Not just outrage, but re-examination. Within 24 hours, journalists weren't just reporting on the moment. They were pulling at its threads. Major outlets like the Washington Post, Reuters, and Politico began assigning teams to sift through decades of Chuck Schumer's legislative record. What started as a story about a single contradiction on border fencing quickly unraveled into a pattern. Votes, speeches, private memos, and donor records that painted a much broader portrait of carefully curated positioning. From archived CS-PAN footage to committee reports, inconsistencies emerged like fault lines. His 2006 support for increasing ICE presence, his 2013 backing of expedited deportation frameworks, his silence on loopholes benefiting certain labor-intensive industries. For years, these shifts had been absorbed into the churn of DC's narrative machine. But now, with Crockett's confrontation serving as the spark, every pivot Schumer had ever made was under the magnifying glass. News segments changed tone. Analysts, once content to summarize his record, now scrutinized it. CNN's Inside Politics aired a 20-minute deep dive titled "Schumer, the Evolution or the Escape." Meanwhile, The Intercept published leaked internal talking points from 2019, one strikingly similar to the "Remain in Mexico" language Schumer had condemned on camera just weeks prior. Headlines stopped offering cover. Instead, they raised questions. Where does principle end and strategy begin? Is Chuck Schumer the last of a dying political class? Why Jasmine Crockett's stand is resonating beyond the left? The myth of the elder statesman began to buckle, not because of a scandal, but because someone had finally refused to let the double standard stand unchecked. But while the Beltway twisted into analysis and damage control, the reaction beyond the Capitol was something far more visceral. Across towns dotting the southern border, from Eagle Pass, Texas, to Yuma, Arizona, truckers, ranchers, retired border agents, and small business owners began speaking up. Not through carefully written letters or coordinated media ops, but through call-in radio shows, local Facebook groups, and comment threads that lit up like wildfire. For years, these communities had been painted in broad strokes, either demonized as xenophobic or patronized as misinformed. But in Jasmine Crockett's words, they heard something they hadn't felt from Washington in a long time: recognition. She didn't dance around it, said Jorge Medina, a second-generation rancher in New Mexico. She said what we've been trying to get across for years. This isn't about hate, it's about order, about knowing that someone in D.C. actually hears the strain we're under. In Laredo, a retired Border Patrol officer named Thomas Reed gave a rare on-camera interview to a local news station. They always say we're on the front lines, but no one ever asks what that actually feels like. She asked, and then she did more than ask. She stood up and said the truth out loud. These weren't campaign volunteers. They weren't donors. They were the very Americans most often dismissed as inconvenient footnotes in the immigration debate. And now they had a voice echoing through Capitol Hill that they hadn't seen coming and wouldn't soon forget. The most striking part wasn't just who supported Jasmine, it was why. They didn't praise her because she dismantled Schumer. They praised her because she refused to play the game. Because when the cameras were rolling, she didn't speak in abstractions. She brought documents, signatures, timelines, and when she looked the most powerful Democrat in the Senate in the eye and asked, "Do you still respect your own voice?" It wasn't performance, it was demand. And that demand rang out across radio airwaves and diners and barbershops, especially among older working-class men who for years had felt erased by narratives that painted them either as relics or villains. Finally, one man wrote in the comments section of a Daily Caller repost, "Someone in D.C. with a spine and a printer." Another tweet from a Vietnam veteran read, "Jasmine Crockett speaks with the clarity I've waited 30 years to hear. I don't care what party she's in. She speaks for us." It was unexpected, yes. A black progressive woman from Texas being championed by men in their 60s from conservative border towns. But it wasn't surprising, because what they recognized wasn't her party. It was her honesty, her refusal to dodge, her willingness to stand in the room, name the contradictions, and make the powerful sit in them. As cable panels continued to spiral into questions about strategy and optics, something far more honest was happening in truck stops and VFW halls. Men who had voted Democrat in the 90s, flipped Republican in the 2000s, and had since given up on all of it, were now watching a clip of Jasmine Crockett on repeat. Not for inspiration, for verification. "She didn't ask for applause," said a retired steelworker in Del Rio. "She asked for accountability, and she backed it up line by line. That's what a leader looks like. Not a speech, not a slogan, a file folder and a straight spine." And as all of this pulsed through the country, from Twitter threads to town halls, Jasmine said nothing. No follow-up press tour, no victory lap, no retaliatory tweet. Her silence was louder than any spin, because while others scrambled to clean up, to recenter, to reposition, she had already done what few ever manage in American politics. She had said what needed to be said, in the room where it needed to be said, with proof in hand and nothing to apologize for. And in doing so, she didn't just shift a narrative. She cracked a wall that had stood for decades. Not the one at the border, but the one built inside the Capitol. The wall of plausible deniability, of protected power, of selective memory. And somewhere out there, in the wide, sun-beaten roads of southern Texas, older men who had long stopped watching C-SPAN were now tuning in again. Not because they trusted the system, but because someone had finally stood inside it and made it flinch. The headlines swelled, the internet roared, and the halls of Capitol Hill whispered her name like a question no one was prepared to answer. But Jasmine Crockett remained still, poised as the storm circled her. And then she stepped into the spotlight again, not to escalate, but to explain. She appeared on every major political analysis program within 72 hours. Meet the Press, Face the Nation, The Situation Room, Real Time, even a late-night spot on The Daily Show. But what stood out most was what she didn't do. She didn't celebrate. She didn't take aim at Schumer personally. She didn't reduce a national reckoning into a partisan skirmish. When asked again and again, "Were you afraid to confront one of the most powerful Democrats in America?" she didn't flinch. Her response was steady, composed, stripped of all theater. "I'm not against him. I'm against the misuse of public trust." There was no venom in her tone, just weight, the weight of someone who understood the difference between an enemy and an institution that had forgotten its purpose. "I didn't walk into that room to embarrass him," she added later in the same segment. "I walked in to remind him." Journalists tried to bait her, asked if Schumer should resign, if the Democrats had lost their moral footing, if she was considering leading a splinter movement. But she stayed grounded. Her focus never drifted from the core of her message: accountability without spectacle. "The public isn't angry because the border is hard to solve," she said. "They're angry because the people they elected stopped being honest about how they're trying to solve it." Her refusal to turn personal betrayal into political fuel struck a rare chord. Analysts expected a takedown artist. What they got was a steward of truth, someone who had carried a file folder into a lion's den and emerged with nothing more than clarity, and still, somehow, with dignity. And then came the clip that would solidify everything. A quiet moment from her PBS interview, filmed in a studio with no live audience, no cheers, no filters. She was asked near the end if there was one thing she wished Schumer had said in response. She paused, not for effect, but for reflection. Then she answered, eyes steady, voice soft. "He once said, 'Borders must be protected.' That's not xenophobia, that's sovereignty. I didn't challenge him to fight me. I challenged him to keep his word." There was no applause, no music swell, just the stillness of a truth too plain to be ignored. The host didn't respond. He just nodded, and the segment faded to black. And that was how the story closed. Not with a dramatic confrontation or a cathartic collapse of a political titan, but with a truth so unadorned it left no room for rebuttal. Schumer, once the orchestrator of political theater, had no encore to offer, no spin, no carefully scripted statement. In the days that followed, his team canceled 2 public appearances. His Twitter feed went silent. The once constant commentary from his press office slowed to a trickle of procedural updates, not out of fear, but because the one response that mattered was already seen. A bowed head, a hand to the ear, and silence. But for Jasmine Crockett, the moment wasn't about winning. It wasn't about domination. It was about disruption, about making the political machine pause long enough to feel its own contradictions. She walked away from that week not with more followers, but with more people listening. People who had once tuned out entirely. And maybe that was the truest victory of all. Not that she shut someone down, but that she made millions sit up, lean forward, and ask themselves the same thing she'd asked him. Do you still respect your own voice? In a town built on sound, she delivered something far more dangerous. Silence. The kind that forces people to look inward. The kind that doesn't need to be followed by clapping. Because sometimes the loudest sound in Washington isn't outrage. It's the absence of excuse. And Jasmine Crockett had just taken all of them away. Washington isn't built to flinch. It bends, it spins, it maneuvers, but it doesn't flinch. Until that week. What Jasmine Crockett had done inside room 226 of the Dirksen Senate office building wasn't just a viral moment. It was a structural breach, a crack in the carefully constructed illusion that power is always prepared, always rehearsed, always in control. And as the footage of her calmly dismantling Chuck Schumer's talking points swept through the country, the aftershock inside the Capitol didn't feel like a tremor. It felt like a rupture. Meetings were canceled, briefings rescheduled. Communication staffers, many of whom had once smirked at the idea of a junior congresswoman from Texas commanding a national platform, scrambled to reread their own boss's past statements on immigration. They weren't looking for policy alignment. They were looking for exposure points, fragile truths, forgotten quotes, signed memos that suddenly felt radioactive. In one office, a legislative aide opened a shared drive from 2013 and muttered, "Did we ever delete that op-ed draft?" In another, a scheduler fielded a nervous call from a senator's chief of staff. "Make sure we don't seat him anywhere near Crockett on the panel. Just optics, okay?" These weren't isolated overreactions. They were the system's immune response, a fever breaking through the suit-and-tie calm. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just questioned power. She disrupted its rhythm. And power, like any organism, reacts violently to what it doesn't control. The Democratic caucus met in private that Friday. It was supposed to be routine, an internal discussion on framing immigration legislation ahead of midterms. But instead of talking messaging points, they whispered strategy. Jasmine's name wasn't on the agenda, but it dominated the conversation. If we reward her with attention, it makes it worse, one senator said. She didn't break rank, another countered. She exposed the cracks we've been taping over for years. No one raised their voice. They didn't have to. The tension in the room said enough. Schumer had lost something that couldn't be measured in polling: control. Outside the chamber, in the marble-floored corridors of Capitol Hill, young staffers passed each other with half smirks and raised eyebrows. Jasmine's moment was being dissected not just in national media, but inside the very offices that once dismissed her as too raw, too loud, too new. Now they spoke of her with a different word: precise. Her calm had been surgical, her documents devastating. Her final question to Schumer, "Do you still respect your own voice?" now replayed not as defiance, but as doctrine. And that doctrine began to take root. 2 days later, a freshman senator from Michigan changed the opening of her town hall address. She didn't quote Jasmine, but the echo was clear. People want leaders who don't just talk about accountability. They want to see it happen in the room. On the House side, a Republican from Arizona mentioned her by name on Fox News. Not to attack, but to say, we need more hearings like that, brutally honest, with no hiding behind titles. And just like that, Jasmine's confrontation ceased being a clip. It became a litmus test. Inside Schumer's camp, damage control had entered its third phase. Phase 1 was denial. Phase 2 was reframing. Phase 3, now in full effect, was quiet retreat. There would be no follow-up press conference, no attempt to reclaim the narrative. His team issued one statement, vague, noncommittal, and then went dark. Publicly, he remained focused on the business of the Senate. Privately, aides avoided mentioning her name. One communications director, when asked by a reporter how the majority leader planned to respond, simply said, "We're not going to elevate her." But it was too late. She didn't need elevation. She had built a platform out of fact, and the country had stepped onto it. Even conservative strategists, caught off guard by how much support Jasmine had received from older working-class voters, began to adjust. Internal polling from southern districts showed a spike in trust when voters were shown only the clip of her speaking, stripped of party affiliation. She's hitting something deeper, a Republican media consultant admitted during a closed-door strategy call. Not just border security, she's restoring faith in the idea that someone will say it straight, no matter who's in front of them. And in a city driven by fear of missteps, Jasmine had just shown that the path to resonance wasn't in polishing, it was in presenting receipts and refusing to blink. But the ripple wasn't confined to politicians and their handlers. It reached the press too. Political correspondents, long accustomed to writing around contradictions, softening headlines to maintain access, suddenly found themselves rereading old interviews with Schumer. One writer at The Atlantic published a piece titled, "The Last Safe Hypocrisy Just Collapsed," laying bare how Jasmine's confrontation had reshaped the boundary between media complicity and journalistic courage. "We've long forgiven powerful figures for inconsistencies," the piece read, "but Jasmine Crockett reminded us that silence in the face of those inconsistencies is a choice, and that confronting them is not impolite. It's necessary." Producers at CNN, MSNBC, and even NPR began pitching more segments not just on policy, but on political transparency, who said what and when. Crockett's moment wasn't being spun as an anomaly anymore. It was becoming a standard, a new kind of accountability, slow, deliberate, backed by paper and precedent, and impossible to ignore. And in Washington, that's the most dangerous kind of momentum, contagious. By the second week, her office inbox overflowed, not with partisan praise, but with quiet acknowledgments from places no one expected. Retired immigration judges, career DHS analysts, former congressional staffers who had long since left the Hill out of frustration with its pageantry. You didn't just call out the lie, one former aide to a Democratic senator wrote. You made us remember when we stopped telling the truth. Another, a former Obama-era policy advisor, wrote simply, I wish I had been as brave in 2012 as you were this week. But perhaps most telling, and quietly humbling, was what began happening inside the Capitol cafeteria, in stairwells, in the long, silent elevator rides. People who hadn't made eye contact with her before now nodded, stepped aside, held doors longer than they had to. Not as a gesture of reverence, but recognition. Jasmine Crockett was no longer the loud one from Texas. She was the one who made the majority leader stare down his own signature and have nothing left to say. No press team could spin that. No crisis memo could bury it. No decades of seniority could erase the image. A lone congresswoman standing with a folder in one hand and the truth in the other, asking not for power, but for honesty. And somehow that had proved far more powerful, more dangerous, more lasting. The ripple didn't stop, it spread. Because once you see someone actually hold power to account, without rage, without showmanship, without fear, you don't forget it. You start to expect it. They called it the Crockett effect. Not in headlines, not at first, but in hushed conversations behind glass conference doors, on the lips of strategists pacing at 2 a.m., and in the nervous shuffles of senior staffers who knew the game had changed, but didn't yet know how. The Capitol had returned to its routine rhythms. Hearings resumed, floor speeches reappeared, the press pool moved on, but beneath the surface, nothing was normal. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just exposed a contradiction. She had exposed a void. And the way she'd done it, without bombast, without deflection, with nothing but receipts and calm conviction, had pierced something Washington rarely shows the public: fear of being outmatched by the truth. In the days that followed her now iconic hearing, a quiet recalibration began. Congressional offices that had previously treated preparation as performance began rewriting their internal protocols. Memos were vetted more aggressively. Communications teams cross-checked past statements against voting records before greenlighting any televised appearance. A mid-level staffer for a Northeast senator was overheard saying, "If we don't have documentation, we don't say it. Not since Crockett." What Jasmine had done wasn't to break the system. She'd revealed its tolerance for contradiction. And once exposed, tolerance quickly turned into scrutiny. Within 2 weeks, a memo quietly circulated between House committee chairs titled, Anticipating Document-Based Challenges During Hearings, an unofficial guide to counteracting the exact kind of strategy Jasmine had deployed. It recommended preemptive narrative framing, a 2-minute response template, and most notably, limiting the number of physical exhibits permitted without prior review. They weren't preparing for a policy debate. They were preparing for her. Not because she raised her voice, but because she raised the bar. Across the aisle, the reaction was different, not hostile, but curious. A handful of GOP members, particularly those from border states, began quoting Jasmine's lines in town halls, not to co-opt her words, but to echo her clarity. It's not about hate, one conservative congressman from Texas said on local radio. It's about order, and you don't have to agree with everything she said to admit. She told the truth while the whole room was hoping she wouldn't. And while some progressives bristled at this unexpected alliance, the country didn't. Because for many Americans, especially those long skeptical of Washington's games, Jasmine Crockett wasn't playing politics. She was restoring gravity to a chamber that had grown weightless from spin. The public began asking questions, not in outrage, but in expectation. Constituents sent emails to their representatives demanding clarity on immigration stances, past and present. What did you say about border policy in 2014? One retired Marine wrote in a letter that was published in the Arizona Republic. And if it's different now, explain why, without blaming a party, a president, or a poll. For the first time in years, clarity had currency again. Not charisma, not clickbait, but clarity, clean, documented, unshakable. Teachers in public policy programs began showing Jasmine's exchange with Schumer in classrooms. This, one professor at Georgetown University said during a graduate seminar, is what congressional hearings were originally meant to be: not theater, not party-line talking points, but a confrontation with fact. Students discussed her cadence, her evidence trail, her refusal to take the bait when Schumer tried to reframe her as emotional or naive. She had never made it about herself, and that was what made her unbreakable. It wasn't personal, it was constitutional. And in a small but telling shift, young women of color entering law and public affairs started citing Jasmine Crockett in their applications, their essays, their internships. She hadn't been a viral star. She had been a standard. Proof that you didn't need to scream to be heard, you didn't need to smile to be trusted, and you didn't need permission to speak truth in a room designed to mute it. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, whispers hardened into tension. Jasmine received 3 invitations to appear on bipartisan panels within a month. 2 from think tanks, 1 from a major policy institute in D.C. Only one of them followed through. The others canceled, citing logistical difficulties. Translation: they weren't ready for her to show up with binders, because she had changed what it meant to show up. Members of the press began adjusting too. Questions became more pointed. Can you clarify your 2016 position on border enforcement? Is your current platform consistent with the DHS testimony you supported in committee? Politicians who once waved away hard questions with charm and volume found that the bar had been moved, and that simply sounding polished wasn't enough. Crockett hadn't just shifted what voters expected from politicians, she'd shifted what journalists expected from themselves. But perhaps the most telling shift came in a hearing weeks later, a completely unrelated subcommittee on agricultural subsidies. A veteran senator offered a statistic to justify a proposed allocation. A junior representative, emboldened by Crockett's precedent, calmly held up a USDA report that directly contradicted it. The room went still. The senator blinked. He didn't attack. He didn't deflect. He said simply, "I'll need to review that further." It was quiet. It was respectful. It was real. And it wasn't a coincidence. It was the new standard. Through it all, Jasmine stayed grounded. She refused most interview requests, choosing instead to publish a single long-form essay in The Atlantic titled "Prepared to be Believed." In it, she wrote, "I didn't speak to be praised. I spoke because silence has a cost, and too many have paid it already. I was not brave. I was prepared. And if that preparation looked like bravery, it's only because we've forgotten what accountable leadership is supposed to look like." She ended with a note not to her supporters, but to her colleagues. The people didn't ask us to be perfect. They asked us to be honest. If that frightens you, then the problem isn't me. It's the job you think you have. That single essay was shared over 2 million times. It was printed and pinned in offices, quoted in campaign launches, taught in high school civics classrooms. For some, it read like a challenge. For others, a reckoning. But for the growing number of Americans who had grown disillusioned with both parties, both narratives, both extremes, it felt like a return, not to idealism, but to expectation. And that expectation was now irrevocable, because Jasmine Crockett hadn't just proven that a young, black, unshakable congresswoman from Texas could stand across from the majority leader and outmatch him line for line. She'd proven that the rules had changed, that from now on, documents mattered more than decorum, clarity more than charisma, and receipts more than rhetoric. That was the new standard. And no one, not even those who tried to bury it, could unwrite it. But beyond the headlines, the documents, and the power shift, something deeper remained. Not political fallout, but a human truth that cut through the noise like a blade through fog. What Jasmine Crockett proved wasn't just that courage could exist in silence, but that integrity requires confrontation. In a room built to silence the underestimated, she didn't shout. She showed up prepared. She didn't attack a man. She exposed a system that rewards loyalty over honesty, reputation over responsibility. The lesson wasn't partisan. It was painfully universal. Power, when left unchecked, will always rewrite its own history, unless someone is brave enough to hold the receipts. And that bravery doesn't always look like fire and fury. Sometimes it looks like a woman standing alone at a microphone, asking a question the powerful hope no one would remember. Do you still respect your own voice? That wasn't just a line, it was a mirror. And in that moment, every person watching, whether in office or at home, was forced to ask it of themselves. Because in the end, the most radical act in Washington is still telling the truth when it's easier to pretend you forgot it. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.